the question I'm asked the most is, what do I need to know to get started in watercolor? And it feels so heavy when that question is asked. The person, I can feel their stress. I can feel the intensity. But friends, I am here to relieve you of all that. Watercolor for beginners is about exploration. It's about creating a glossary of tools to use at your disposal to discover joy. Watercolor for beginners isn't about shoulds, musts, have-tos. Watercolor for beginners is about how can I's, when do I, how does it feels. This is such an important session. If you just watch one of my videos, let it be this one. I've actually taught this content to hundreds of folks that have paid a lot of money for it. And I don't say that to brag, please. Know this. I say that to let you know that I feel from the bottom of my heart that it is time to just release this into the world. Now listen, I approach watercolor in a very different way. You're going to hear me teach in a way, say things in a way that will contradict what others, very famous YouTubers and beyond, have taught you. And that is not me being rude. I just want to put that out there. It's just me being me. My way isn't right. My way is different. That's it. And if you've been searching for something different in watercolor, something that feels less heavy, less stressful, less full of rules, you have come to the right place. Okay, I have one more thing to say. Do you want to paint with me? Well, let's go. So you want to know the basics of watercolor, like where to start. But then what do you do with all that? How do all these basic techniques work together in real life? That is the question. I've taught thousands of people over the years, and the biggest roadblock I see folks running into again and again is, I don't know what to use. I don't have a ton of money to spend on this. Even if I did learn the, quote, right techniques, what do I do with them? And there's 50 million different types of watercolor palettes and even more brushes, and oh my gosh. And then you know what happens? They don't do any of it. They just walk away. Well, friends, I'm here today because I don't want you to walk away from watercolor. I want you to walk towards it. Maybe even run a little bit. I mean, I don't run, but you know what I mean. I want you to run towards the joy of watercolor and all that it's holding for you. Listen, I have my favorite brushes. I have my favorite palettes. But the number one thing that you need to know to get started is to meet yourself where you're at. Use what you have. Or use what is the easiest and most affordable to get your hands on. For the first part of today's lesson, I'm going to be using Crayola watercolors. That's right, because I want to prove to you that you don't need to be super precious about your supplies. Now, it's a different thing once you get into this and you know you're loving it and you want to level up. That's a whole different ballgame. But don't let the pursuit of the, quote, perfect materials slow you down and stop you from chasing the joy that is watercolor. Gosh, I hope my passion doesn't come off as like bossiness, because I don't mean to be bossy. I just feel so passionate, and I know how watercolor has changed my life, and I want it to change yours too. I'm going to teach you the basics. But then I'm going to follow up with a step-by-step painting that clearly shows you all of these techniques, how they work in a real-life painting. So you're left feeling empowered to move on and create your own artwork. Okay, let's talk about supplies. Now, I mentioned I'm going to be using Crayolas for this section. Trust me, If that's what you have, please use it. Don't delay. Just dive right in. I'm also going to be using my brush collection, the Art for Joy's Sake brush collection. If you want to know more about it, check in the information section below. And then Academy watercolor paper. Friends, I love this paper. It's affordable and it lets me not feel guilty about the fact that I use watercolor paper a little bit like I use water. Okay, so pause the video after I finish this sentence because I want you to recreate this chart. My paper's square. I don't care. Whatever size your paper is, just make it work. Create this chart. You've got the word wowed at the top and then a column on the left, wet on wet, wet on dry, wet on damp. And while you're creating this chart, I want you to spray down your watercolors. Get them all nice and juicy. All right, go ahead, give this a pause and come back when you've got your chart ready. I know what you're thinking. This feels like a little bit like elementary art class, but trust me, these charts, we're going to make 2 of them that you create today. They're going to be yours and you're going to get to refer to them again and again. Remember, friends, this is a course that I have taught to folks nationwide and globally over the years. Thousands of folks that have paid money for this particular content. And the thing they tell me year after year again and again is they love their charts and they do use them often. All right, let's talk a little bit about wowed. Wowed in my world is the trifecta of watercolor. Once you master wowed, you are going to soar. So wowed, wet on wet, wet on dry, wet on damp, wowed. So watercolor is all about pigment and water and how they interact at different quantities. That's basically it. So for today, I'm going to be using this 1/2-inch dagger from my brush collection. The first thing I want you to do is take some clean water and make a real lazy square in that first section. Pick up your favorite color and paint over that clean water. You're already going to notice how the pigment is moving in the clean water very easily. Grab a second color and add to it. Watch how those 2 colors mingle. And then if you're feeling adventurous, add a third. That, my friends, is wet on wet. You can start with clean water and drop in color to see the explosions. You could start directly on the page with the color, drop in more color to see the explosions. That is your classic wet on wet. Take a moment to watch what's happening. Now, if you forgot to spray your palette, especially if you're using Crayolas or any other student grade watercolor, you're probably not going to be seeing the intensity of color and the explosiveness that you're seeing on my screen. So just want to remind you that spraying your palette is gold. It loosens up the pigments. It creates like a syrupy consistency that really, really gets onto the wet paper and does its thing. If you need to pause, spray the palette and try this again, go right ahead. Now I'm grabbing my flat wash brush. It's a 3/4 inch. Friends, a note about brushes, use what you have. Don't worry if you don't have mine. And I'm going right in and laying down some color like I mentioned earlier, just making a lazy little square, getting some color on there, rinsing my brush. And now I'm grabbing another color and dabbing it in to just see what happens. See what happens. Lovely. So good. Now, this is a Crayola palette. The colors are limited. Things are going to be kind of muddy a little bit, but I wanted to use this palette to prove a point and that you shouldn't let whatever simple or meager materials that you have stop you from getting yourself going with watercolor. Now, let's look at it in real life example. I am painting in some very simple teardrop flower petals in clean water. And I'm adding in some color on top of them and letting that color just conform and shape to the brushstroke of water that I just laid down. See that? That is your classic wet on wet. Beautiful. This is an in real life example of how this fundamental technique actually functions. So good. And I'm changing up my colors as I go. Started with red and a little bit of orange, a little bit of yellow. And there we have it. That is your classic wet on wet. You want to get even more adventurous? Grab a little bit of that brown or the black in your Crayola set and dab it around the center of the flower. and boom, watch it start to explode. That's fun. And friends, it's going to explode. It's going to get out of control. It's going to be weird looking when it dries. I'm telling you this just from experience, but we don't learn anything when we don't push the limits of the material. So it's good for you to experience this. All right, next up is wet on dry. Grab a color and apply it right to the dry page. Right on there, that's wet on dry. Experiment with another lazy square, but with less water on your brush and see how that feels. Now go in and make some simple strokes, curving to meet each other underneath. Let's call it a flower. I don't know, maybe what are they called? A water lily? Or it doesn't have to be anything. I just want you to see how the wet on dry produces a much more intense color quickly because you don't have as much water on your brush to dilute the pigment. See that? Now I told you things were going to get muddy because it's a very limited palette, but stick with me. Now we're quickly getting into a wet on wet situation. And that's why these techniques, these three techniques, they're so integral to one another because they play into each other so easily and so quickly. Grabbing that 3/4 inch flat wash brush again. And we are going to, now my water isn't terribly clean, but that's okay. I got a little bit of a blue haze, but I'm going to wet down this entire long skinny rectangle on the wet on damp section. Just wet it down. You don't want a puddle. You just want a nice, even, damp surface. We're going to experiment now with the 1/2 inch dagger, and we're going to just make a simple stroke. Right away, I want you to see what the stroke looks like right away before that wash of water underneath starts to dry. And then I am going to allow about a minute in between each stroke. Now we're going to kind of fast forward through this, and I'm going to make another stroke. And I want you to see how it changes. The beauty of wet on damp is that you get the explosion, but it's more subtle and it's slower. So when you add wet color to a damp page, you can get these glorious, diffused, soft effects. And you can see how that's changing as that under layer of water dries. Friends, your chart does not have to be perfect. Let that be another lesson for today. If you've got some paint that's kind of leaked into other sections, maybe the green of your wet on damp has leaked into the purple of your wet on dry, it is okay. I want you to get through this chart. You can always do this chart again at another time if you want to be extra or if you felt like your first was too sloppy, but just do me a favor and get through this one. No tearing up pages, no getting frustrated with yourself if your chart isn't perfect. Because I guarantee you, I don't care what kind of color is going wherever it's going, you are learning something right now. You really are. It's good stuff. Moving on now and watching how these green strokes subtly get more crisp, more defined as the paper underneath dries. And just think about how that can be used later on for adding shadows, for adding depth. It's a wonderful realization that watercolor isn't just lots of water, messy pigment, splashing everywhere. It also has the most glorious subtleties imaginable. Friends, I gotta say, I am having a blast revisiting these techniques. It's such a joy to bring them to you. And if you're having fun, I would love if you'd give this video a boop. And a boop is just a like, and it lets I almost said Instagram algorithm, the YouTube algorithm know that we're all having a good time and that more of you should join in. I'd appreciate it. But let's keep moving. Yes, we're about to make another chart. It's gotta happen. This time our chart has 5 sections. We're going to be talking about 5 different techniques: flooding, ombre, lifting, scrubbing, and my favorite, line work. Now, flooding, some people will call a dragging effect. Ombre also. I think these have kind of differences, nuances, so I've given them separate names. I guess what I'm saying here, friends, is there's a lot of incredible content here on YouTube about watercolor, and everybody approaches things a little differently, myself included. So I'm not sitting here trying to make you believe I'm reinventing the wheel, but I am building the wheel a little bit differently. That's all. So if you're sitting there wondering, like, wait a minute, what's flooding? Well, it's another word, another term for dragging. And that's just one example. But if you have questions about how I've named things, definitely hit me up in the comments and I will explain it for you. No worries. So the thing about flooding is about control, because watercolor, as we know, friends, it has a mind of its own. So let me show you what flooding is all about. I am going to use my Hero brush, the 1/4" dagger. Now, before we get any further, I have changed palettes. I am using my Holbein palette. This is a much better quality palette, but again, you can keep using your Crayolas or whatever it is that you have. The key to getting strong pigment, even out of an affordable student grade palette, is just spraying that palette down. I want you to add some intense color to the far left side. I don't care what it looks like, just a couple strokes. And then I want you to rinse your brush, fill it up with tons of water, and just start pushing some of that clean water towards, in my case, the red, and just push it around. Keep adding clean water and push and flood. You're flooding that color. You're flooding that brightness. You're pushing it around. You're bullying that color. Just imagine how this technique can come in handy when you're creating shading, when you're creating highlights, because you can also flood with a color. There you go. This is essentially wet on wet, but we're building on wet, because we are not just laying the color on top of a wet surface. We are pushing the color around. We're flooding. We're using a lot of pigment and a lot of water to push and move the pigment around the page. It's incredible. Once you know how to work the water and the pigment in this way, you won't be able to remember a time when you didn't have it at your fingertips. It's incredible. Did I already say that? I feel like I say that all the time. So in real life, mountains. I'm going to create a very simple mountain scene here. Very, very impressionistic. Couple of colors, and then boom, I'm flooding in from underneath some of that just clean water, flooding it up, pushing it up towards the edge of that mountain scene I created, and I'm getting instant dimension, instant shadow and highlight. And now I'm flooding with yellow to create a little bit of foreground. Look at that. So that is flooding used in real life, friends. You could use flooding in a sky, add a little bit of blue, a little bit of a bouncy, swirly blue effect in the sky, and then quickly flood underneath or to the side of those blue brush strokes with clean water. And you'll start to see the beginnings of a cloud appear. Really cool. I love it. Now, whether you are a more realistic painter or you're more impressionistic like me, these techniques work. They flow. Because friends, I got to tell you, sometimes I get super hyper realistic. Oh yeah, I do. And these techniques work, whether I'm being loosey-goosey, free, spirit, Kristy, or I'm being super tight, conscientious, and in the zone. Next up, we have what I call ombre. And I love ombre for creating a very smooth, evenly transitioned, dark to light effect. This is great if you're working on galaxies, aurora borealis. It's when you don't want that cauliflower effect going on where things burst and dry with weird edges. So you lay down a little bit of color. I'm using the 3/4" flat wash brush so I can get coverage a little easier. And then I go right next door with some clean water. And I basically start dragging out that color and keep adding clean water right next to my last brush stroke. Don't panic if you get a little bit of an explosion, a little intrusion from a previous section. It's okay. And just keep dragging that out, clean water. This is also a form of pulling. Dragging it out, dragging it out. And this is how you get a smooth transition from bright to light, dark to light, opaque to sheer. And you can use this in countless ways. It doesn't have to just be for skies or galaxies or the sort. This can be used to create the most gorgeous flower petals with highlights and shadows made effortlessly. So a key to this is not using too much water or things will get out of control quickly. Now I laid down one stroke of that pink. I'm using my cat's tongue brush, and right next to it, I laid down a stroke of just water and let them bleed together. And look at that. One stroke of color, rinse my brush, have a nice amount of water on the cat's tongue, put it right next door, and boom. Instant, beautiful, shaped petal. Just going to keep going with that. You could change your colors up a little bit. Done. That is ombre used in real life. Love it. Let's use the ombre effect to create a leaf because why not? One stroke, kind of a nice slow curve, and some water right next door. Look at that. Some more right next door, repeating that shape, that curve, that initial brush stroke. And you, friends, have a leaf instantly. Gorgeous. I'm a big believer in KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Now, my dad was in the military, and that was, a very non-PC kind of colloquialism. But it's something I think about a lot. KISS, Kristy, KISS. Keep it simple. The things that can be simple and beautiful and effortless, why not let them be? All right, now quickly for lifting, I'm putting down a little bit of color, a couple of blues right next to each other, but we're not going to do anything with them quite yet because I need them to dry a little bit. So work with me. Friends, if you need to pause, take a break, take a breath, get a drink, do it. But I've got a couple of greens right next to each other. I'm letting them run into each other on purpose, but just know we're going to come back to that section. Next, we have scrub. I'm still using the cat's tongue brush. Friends, let me tell you a little bit about the cat's tongue brush. It is a lovely stiff brush. It doesn't have as much bounce as many of your daggers or your round brushes because it's shorter, comes to a point, and it's fantastic for control, fantastic for texture, and it's also amazing for getting a really good amount of color on the page quickly and intensely. So for scrubbing here, I'm doing just that. I'm just stroking some red onto the page, not really worrying about exactly how. And I am also going to come back to that section later. So take a moment, get your lifting section and your scrub section juiced up with some paint and get them drying. And now we're going to move on to line work and come back. Line work, I am using a liner brush. Let's talk a little bit about the liner brush. A traditional liner brush has a longer bristle. My liner brush is it's just a little bit over a 1/2 inch long. And you might think, oh my gosh, that sounds like it would be so out of control. But it's not. It's lovely. It takes a little bit of practice. And that's what we're doing here today. But oh, friends, it creates the most graceful, undulating, effortless lines that you could imagine. Now, the key to your line work and using the liner brush is making sure you have a good amount of water and pigment on the brush. When you don't have quite enough water, you'll start to see texture in your line. Your line will look a little raggedy. If you like that look, great. I sometimes love that look. But if you're not feeling it, just dip the tip of your liner brush in a little bit of water and move on. And you're going to see that line become so smooth and lovely. And chef's kiss. It just deserves a chef's kiss. A little bit of practice with this line quality technique will go a long way. Try to place lines super, super close together, barely touching or not touching at all. Try to create kind of a wave-like appearance with a collection of lines. Another favorite exercise of mine is creating lines, vertical lines. up and down, different widths, and notice the pressure difference. If you press just a little bit on this brush, it will make a thicker line just like that. Thinner, thicker, thinner, thicker. You can go back and forth so easily. And I love that. It creates gorgeous branches. It's just such a wonderful brush. And you can make small, short, curved lines. Imagine what you could use those for, adding shape to a tree trunk and dimension to a tree trunk. You can literally bounce the brush up and down until the paint runs out to create incredible textures. You can use that technique radiating around the center of a flower or in a landscape in the distance to create a sense of some shrubbery on a horizon line or trees on a horizon line. I guess you really wouldn't have shrubbery on a horizon line, but you know what I mean. Now that our lifting section has dried a bit, we're going to go back and work in that area. You're going to get a clean brush. I'm using the cat's tongue brush, and I am adding some clean water and a little upward motion. And this has been dry for about 10 minutes or so. And I'm lifting up, scooping up the moisture and blotting it on my paper towel. This, friends, is lifting. Scoop it up, blot. Now, depending on the brand of paints, you're going to be able to lift a lot easier or not so easy. Just depends on the type of paints. Again, I'm using Holbein and they lift beautifully. Imagine what you can do with lifting. It's a wonderful way to create instant highlights. It's a wonderful way you can lift away paint you put down previous, and then you can add in a different color over top while that surface is still a little bit damp. So you'd be back to a wet on damp. Lifting is something I use all the time. It's become almost self-conscious. It's just a way to continue to control the pigment on the page and the amount of water on the page. And how does lifting work in real life? Let's see. I'm going to create a leaf here, just a simple shape, press, drag, and lift, and then fill in the middle because I am using a smaller brush. And we'll come back to that later once it's had a little time to dry. Going back to scrubbing. Now, scrubbing is basically a little bit more of an aggressive version of lifting and more haphazard. So you can add the clean water on top of that dried pigment and you can scrub it around and lift, or you can just scrub out and let the pigment, the softer tone of the pigment, just scrub out into other areas of the painting. Scrubbing also works just as a way to lay down paint. Imagine creating gorgeous flowers with this technique. It's bouncy, scrubby, swirly. It's just a little bit more of an active way to get paint on the page. It's definitely not a graceful way to get paint on the page. Your hand is moving constantly. The motion is kind of limited to your fingers, so you're not getting a lot of sweeping motion. I love scrubbing for certain types of flowers. And remember, you can scrub a little bit and blot on your paper towel a little bit to remove paint. It's a great way to soften edges between two colors. The one note I will say is don't over scrub. Don't use too much pressure. Don't stay in one spot. With this motion for too long, you could start to break down your paper. All right, while that dries a little bit too, let's go back to line work. Line work isn't just limited to a liner brush. I'm using the cat's tongue here. It has a dimensional point, which means it comes to a point, but it doesn't come to a fine hair-like point. It's a dimensional point. So you can make gorgeous lines with it, but they're a little bit thicker, a little bit more robust. Same with the 1/2-inch dagger. Light touch and just whisper above the page and look at those gorgeous, soft, graceful lines you can get. I love it. Try it. Try this with whatever brushes you have. I'm going to try it with the 3/4-inch flat wash brush. Wait till you see. This brush is magic. It can do so much. Pick up a little paint, dab, and then let's see what we can do to create some line work. You'll be surprised. Look at that. Look at that. I'm using just the corner of the brush on an angle. Again, thicker lines for sure, but imagine branches, stems, the beginnings of trees. You can use this in so many different ways. You can literally bounce this brush up and down perpendicular to the page. My hand will move in a moment. You can see what I've created. Look at that. That's a tree line in the making. So now we're going to go back up to the ombre section where I created this sweet little flower. And I want to show you in real life how line work can literally bring to life a flower. All right, so we're going to just grab a little bit of pigment. You can choose to be soft. You could go with a soft pink. I'm going to go a little bit more bold because I really want this line work to show up. And I'm radiating out these thin lines, as thin as I can get them from the center of the flower. And just don't mind my hand. It's the way I hold my brush. I am having this brush almost perpendicular to the page. Very light touch, and I'm following the contour of the petal. And guess what? I love going outside the lines of those petals because when this flower started, it was very bubbly, very sweet, almost childlike in appearance because of the shape of the painted petals. But when I'm adding this line work, I'm making each petal a little bit wider in areas, come to a point in areas with the line work, and it becomes a much more elegant and graceful flower. Gorgeous. Look at that. Look at that. I'm going around the center, which is the tip of my liner now, and doing a little scrubbing action, scrubbing with a liner brush. See, what I love about these techniques, once you learn the basics, then you start to figure out how the basic techniques mingle with one another. And that's when the magic starts happening. Now, friends, I want you to stick around because we're going to do just that really soon here. We're going to paint together. We're going to paint an actual composition. And I'm going to show you how all these techniques play, how they mingle, and how they love to work with one another. Now, I'm using the 1/4-inch dagger to show you some line work on this leaf. I love this 1/4-inch dagger, and if for a lot of people it's very much like the number 6 or 8 round brush that comes to a nice point. You might have one of those. It's just incredibly versatile. You can make such thin lines with it. I love it. Another thing you can do with the liner brush is you can sketch with it like I am now. Look at that. Create a thin line, little stems coming out from your flower, and then turn the ends of them into sweet little teardrop leaves. I love that so much. Oh, you have to try this little flower. You have to. It's so fun. Friends, if you're having a good time, just a quick reminder, if you'd like to give this video a boop, I'd be all for it. Thank you so much. Now we're going back to the lifting section. We're going to see what we're going to do with this leaf. I'm using my number 2 round brush, clean water on that brush. I'm going along the top edge and I added some clean water initially, and now I'm stroking it away. I'm lifting it away just along that top edge to give a little bit of a highlight, like the sun is shining right down on the top edge of that leaf. Look at that. So simple, so effortless to create some amazing dimension. Now, don't forget, your leaf is wet in areas now. It's definitely still damp in areas. You can go on in there and do a little wet on wet action with some darker pigment, which I'm about to do. Look at that, gorgeous. Now you have some really high highs, meaning super light, and some really low lows, meaning dark. And talk about dimension. It's gorgeous. Now add a little water back in, flood in a little water. Remember flooding, adding water or pigment and pushing that paint around that's already on the page, and things will start to blend and mingle. And there you have it. Gorgeous, gorgeous. Let's see some scrubbing in real life. Going back to that cat's tongue, got the point facing out. I'm radiating around an imaginary center, letting the paint run out, and I'm just scrubbing around and around and around until I have this kind of blobby looking flower. I'm immediately adding a little yellow around the center. This is fast and loose, friends. So we went from scrubbing right into wet on wet. It's good. Wait till you see this. Going around the edge now with a little scrubbing, bouncing action with a bright pink. Think about this. This could be a mum. This could be a carnation from a top-down view. So many things. This could be a pom-pom flower, just a basic. Imagine a bunch of these little flowers clustered together with some stems connecting them. Great for filler. And then I'm doing a little scrubbing action to create some leaves. So your watercolor brushstrokes don't always have to be graceful and fluid. They can be bouncy, they can be scratchy, they can be a little messy to really mix it up on the page. Adding a little extra green on top of that yellow for some instant dimension. And there you have the beginnings of a sweet little flower that you can use in so many ways. All right, friends, in this next section, we are going to paint together. We're going to do a leafy composition, and I want to just explain a little bit how this is going to work. And because I don't want you to be overwhelmed, but this section, I believe, is really important. This is where we're going to bring it all together. And in my classes, this is how I teach. I teach the basics. I have you make your own charts of the techniques. And then we get down to the fun of actually painting a composition that brings together all of the techniques. So I would recommend keeping your charts nearby. If you need to rewind and watch another section again, don't feel bad. Don't feel like you have to get through this all in one sitting. Come back to it if you feel like you need a breather. But friends, we're about to have fun, and I think you're about to have your watercolor mind blown just a little. So here's what we're gonna do. As I narrate what I'm doing, you're going to see little call outs on the screen, little words on the screen. And every time I use a technique that I've taught you earlier in this video, it's going to flash that technique so you know exactly what I'm using. All right, friends, here we go. I'm using the Holbein watercolor palette. I've got my water jug. And as you can see, my water isn't perfectly clean, but you know what? It's okay. It's okay. But if you need to take a beat, clean your water. I'm using Academy watercolor paper still. I am going to start with the 3/4 inch flat wash brush, and I am going to paint in clean-ish water. Big teardrop leaf. You're going to see the shape of this a little better once I start to add color, so don't panic. And just pick a green you love. Pick a green you love. I know I'm probably going to get some angry comments about the state of my water, but I like to show that we don't need to be entirely precious about our water all the time. That dirty water isn't always going to make or break your painting. But anyway, another leaf. That one I did just a little bit more squat. Going to the 1/2 inch dagger right in there with some darker green. If you don't have a pre-mixed darker green, just add a little bit of red to the green you do have. Adding some water here, pushing back on that darker green I just added. This is a great time, friends, to reshape. If you're not 100% happy with the shape of your leaf, reshape a little bit. All your edges are wet. Add a little more pigment, a little more color, and switch up that shape, refine. You might be wondering about that white space up in the leaf, the first leaf that I created. That's going to get filled in. That's going to not be, we're certainly not going to neglect that area. But as you paint and you're in the moment, you might find spots like that that don't get, quote, painted in right away. And it's okay. Don't let them dry completely, but don't worry about it too much. Now let's talk about the size of the paper. If this is new for you, I'm working like 12 by 12 inch. Don't feel like you have to work that big. Use what you have for sure. You can scale all of this down. Also, you could work on a bigger paper and just not fill the whole page. Grabbing a little blue. I actually got 3 blues on my brush there. And if you're curious about the way that I grab multiple colors all at once, you might want to watch this video. It's a cool one. I do a lot of mixing on the page. I'll pick up multiple colors at a time from my palette. And the palette gets messy, but not as messy as you think. All right, press, drag a little bit and lift. Press, drag a little bit and lift. Press, drag a little bit and lift. We're making a cluster, and then press, drag, and twist as you lift. Press, drag, and twist as you lift. And look at this. I'm creating some direction. I've got a spray of leaves that are going up and curving down just by changing the angle of my brush. Now, I've got too much pigment on there, so I got a little water on my brush, and I'm pulling back some of the color and blotting on my paper towel. can do that right away. And the secret sauce to this particular style of painting, this particular technique, the minute you add clean water to an area, do a little bit of lifting and add a little last touch of clean water to that area, it automatically, naturally just softens, diffuses, and blends everything together. It's a lovely little hack. Look how I'm getting into the nooks and crannies of those leaves. They're smallish leaves, and I'm using a not so smallish brush, but I'm using the tip of that 1/2-inch dagger, and wow, you can get a lot going on. Yes, I'm already grabbing my liner brush because I want to get some structure in here with this little spray of leaves, and I'm connecting them with the slightest, wispiest line just to give them some direction and some structure, grabbing 2 greens and a little bit of turquoise on the brush. And I'm going right in to sketching with my liner brush. Friends, there's no rules here. You don't have to slowly build up color from light to dark. You don't have to do all the washy stuff first and then build up your detail. I felt like doing this. I felt like sketching into my painting right away. I have my number 2 round brush, and I'm just filling with a little bit of yellow on that brush, filling in. And when I'm doing that, I'm filling and I'm pulling color from that line I just made with my liner brush. And those 2 colors are just diffusing together beautifully. You might be wondering, Kristy, do you have a plan where this composition is going? No, this is something I do all the time. I love painting leaves, and I will just start with 1 or 2 big leaves and build out from there. So you don't always have to have a plan. Cat's tongue brush, and I'm just adding in some very short, quick, bouncy movements on the top edge here around the point. Just adding in some dimension, pushing that paint around with a little bit of water. I am not a realistic painter, friends, but when my paintings are all said and done, they're definitely recognizable. They've got an edge of realism, but I kind of embellish on reality. And so when I'm painting like this, I'm not always thinking of, okay, what direction is the sun coming from? And no. Now, there's nothing wrong with painting that way, but it's not the only way to paint. And it's not the only way to get a recognizable, finished painting. Okay, I did a little downstroke there, press, drag, long, and lift. Press, drag, long, and lift. And I'm repeating with just the water on my brush. And look at that. Gorgeous, gorgeous light to dark I'm getting so effortlessly. I love to remind you that you can do the press, drag, and lift technique with a downstroke or an upstroke. Now, friends, the composition aspect of this might feel very overwhelming to you. I'm just repeating the same kind of technique over here, 1 dark stroke, and then blending it out with water as I go and shape the leaf. But back to what I was saying, you might feel overwhelmed with the compositional aspect of this. And I'm going to tell you something, a little hack. Follow compositions that other people have made. Now, don't copy others' artwork, but go on Instagram, follow floral designers. In my last video, this one here, I mentioned how I love a floral designer. Her name is Tulipina. She's incredible. And you can follow the compositions of others. Look up floral styling. Google that, find it on TikTok. Search that tag or hashtag on Instagram, floral styling, and you will find so many beautiful compositions that you can turn into paintings that allow you to not worry about composition yet. You don't have to worry about all the things all at once. I'm adding a little bit of turquoise into my damp leaf here just because I think it's pretty. I'm still using that 1/4-inch dagger, and I'm just bossing this paint around. I always say watercolor is like that living medium. It still lives on the page because when the page is wet and you're adding wet pigment, everything blends around. And I also say that you should kind of succumb or surrender is a better word, to watercolor and let it do what it wants. But at the same time, there's a caveat. You can bully around watercolor just a little bit. With more pigment and more water, you can become the boss just a little bit. I went along the edge there, add a little bit of darker pigment. It felt a little too scratchy, too textury, so I added a little water right next to it to soften it up. And remember what I said about reshaping. Whenever your leaves, whatever you're painting is wet or damp, you still have the opportunity to reshape. So I'm getting a little precious about the very tip of that leaf. I want it to look like it's like turning and twisting just a little bit. So moving on with the 3/4 inch wash brush, getting a little water and pigment on there. I am holding it almost perpendicular, so you'll be able to see what I'm doing in a moment. Just creating a few bolder stems. I want this to feel, I've decided now, finally, I want this to feel like a spray of leaves, almost like a little nosegay, a little bouquet of leaves. So I'm creating that cluster of stems towards the bottom. I'm going back in with that 1/4 inch dagger, bullying around that leaf. I don't know why I'm obsessing over that one leaf, but it needs to stop for the love. Goodness gracious. You may be wondering about my water pot here. This is a custom pot that I had made. The center well obviously is for super duper dirty water. And then my clean-ish water is on the outer rim, and I love it. But you can accomplish the same thing with 2 containers. So now I clean my brush really well because I'm going for yellow, and yellow is such an easily contaminated color. And I just scrubbed in some shapes, some bouncy, loopy, scratchy shapes, kind of stemming from one of those stems that I just painted in. And now I go right in at the base of that yellow where all the yellow stems converge and added orange. And that yellow was pretty wet, so I'm already seeing like, oh, dang, that is pretty, that's a little out of control. So I'm probably going to come back to that. Press, lift at all different angles. I'm creating some yellow filler flowers here at the top. Grab different yellows, press and lift. There's no drag on that particular stroke. It's just a press and a lift at different angles. All right, I'm going back to that orange, friends, because she got out of control. My goodness. So I got a little clean water on my brush, and I'm going to push back and blot. Push back, scoop up, and blot. Push back, scoop up, and blot. And we got things back in control right away. These are the kind of moments, I just want to point this out. These are the moments that have potential for creative panic, where things are bleeding too much and you're like, oh my gosh, or you accidentally drop a few splotches of color on your page and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm done. I've ruined it. But these are the moments that I actually want you to, instead of panic, I want you to take a breath and realize that there's always a way to fix it. There is always, I'm going to be bold, there's always a way to fix it. I'm adding a little orange to the yellow cluster flowers at the top here. I made sure to kind of pull out some of the color from them so they weren't too wet this time. Going in with my liner brush and creating some stems with just a dark green. You do what you have, do what you love, do what's in the crevice of your palette. Don't be precious about it. The one thing to make this look successful is to just have all those stems radiating from a single point, and it will then look like a little spray in a bouquet. Going down to the first flower, the out of control flower, and creating a little bit of a thicker stem because this is a larger flower. So I'm giving it a little bit of a stronger head, a couple extra lines, and bringing it down into that main stem area. I even painted, look at that, a few little thicker leaves at the base. Gorgeous. And I did that with my liner brush, just a little extra pressure on the liner brush. Now I'm adding some water into this yellow flower because I just want a little more blendy blend, and I'm refining the shape because I can. Scooping out some of that. I feel like I want some highlight. Scooping out with a clean brush and blotting. Scooping out and blotting. Friends, are you having a good time? I'd love if you subscribe to the channel. I'm just going to come out and say it. I don't want you to miss anything. I really appreciate this community. I love the conversations we have in comments. I reply to all comments. So give this video a boop, a like, and hit that subscribe button. I'm going back to sketching with my liner brush. I'm a big fan of like droopy moments in my paintings, like viney, like vines that are creeping and crawling and drooping in areas. And a really wonderful way to get that effect is by sketching with your brush. And then I'm going in and filling with just whatever's on this number 2 brush, filling in with a little bit of water and letting the color from the outline from the sketch that I did of the leaf blend in. And it's just such a fun effect. It's a way to keep things interesting in your painting. I'm a big fan of painting leaves in a couple different ways throughout one composition. I just think it keeps things really interesting. Now we can start to see this beauty come into life. And if you're painting along with me, I just want to say bravo. I just want to say bravo. This is a lot. This lesson is jam-packed with information, with aha moments, I hope. And so if you're still here with me, kudos to you. Kudos to you. I went in with that 3/4 inch wash brush, added just a few little scratchy strokes at the bottom just to suggest a few leaves. Now I'm grabbing a coral color that's pre-mixed on my palette and adding it over top of the orange on all of these yellow flowers. If you don't have a coral, mix together an orange and a pink, an orange and a red, and a little white even. Or if you don't have coral, don't worry about it. And I just like, it gives it a little softening vibe. The orange is a little bright. Okay, so at this point, I would suggest letting your painting dry just a smidge. Not to the point of totally being dry, but to the point of damp. You can walk away, grab a coffee. You could use a hair dryer, but be careful because crazy things can happen. Okay, so here you notice as things dried, I had a little bit of a weird splotchy moment. I'm just going to add a little bit of clean water right over top and blend, blend, blend. Because honestly, this painting hasn't been sitting for a long time. But if you were to discover one of those blotches and your painting was sitting for a couple hours or days, you might have to work a little bit harder to remove that kind of hard edge. Just taking that 1/2 inch dagger with a darker olive green on there. If you don't have a pre-mixed olive green, just take a little bit of green, blue, and red, even a little yellow, and you'll get something pretty darn close. And adding a few splotches on the underbelly of that very first big leaf. Now I'm going in, press, drag, lift, a little bit of a curve as I drag, mirror that, press, drag, lift, but I'm not mirroring it the whole way. There we go. I just want to add a few more leaves up here, grabbing my liner brush, adding a few more stems in here. Oh, look at that. Gorgeous. Right through that leaf. Even though that leaf is damp, it's okay. It'll diffuse and give just the softest look, but there we go. A little more sketching, a few more stems. I just want to exaggerate this kind of vine effect that I have going because I really love it. I really love it. Sorry with my hand placement, but just know when my hand is like that in a painting, it means I'm holding my brush almost perpendicular to the page. Going back to the cat's tongue because I want a little more control and filling in some of these sketchy leaves with a yellow. This yellow is a little bit more like a mustard yellow, so if you don't have a pre-mixed, just take whatever yellow you have, add a touch of brown, you'll be good to go. This is really coming together. Remember to compliment yourself, friends. If you're new here and you don't know what I mean by compliment yourself, I always refer to this video. It's a good mindset habit to start establishing in your art journey. I'd highly recommend watching it. Now I'm using the 1/4 inch dagger to add in some line work. Remember, you don't have to just use the liner brush for the line work. Love it. Light hand, just the right amount of paint and water on the brush, and you'll be able to get a nice gliding line. Okay, friends, I'm grabbing the 1/2 inch dagger and I'm just correcting a little blobby. I like to keep it real with you so you can see the real life little oopsies that happen during a painting experience and how to fix them. I'm taking a damp, clean brush and I'm blending some of those dark marks that I added a few moments ago. Just remember, your wet page is an opportunity. The damp page is an opportunity. Until things dry, you have all the control and you can change. And yes, I did just add green, peach, red, and pink to my brush to create this gorgeous dark color for the veins on this leaf. Don't be afraid to get a little creative with the colors you use in your leaves. Because I don't know about you, but when I go into like a plant shop, I'm just marveled by the amount of color that is in some of the most gorgeous houseplants that are out there. And they're not all just greens and yellows and ivories. There's some gorgeous red veins and purples. And so just get creative. Get creative. This is your domain. This is your little world that you're creating. Look how beautiful that is with the red veins. I love it. I'm still working through that little splotchy weird moment on this leaf. So I'm just keeping an eye on it as I work through the painting. Little bit of scrubbing here just to keep things smooth as it dries. You have to, watercolor, it lives on the page. I've mentioned it before. So something to keep in mind is to just keep an eye on some troublesome spots as you're working through a painting. If you know you've got a weird splotch that's starting to dry or whatever the case may be, keep an eye on them. As long as those areas are damp, you're still going to be able to work and kind of correct in those areas as you paint. Going back with my liner, picking up a little bit of orange. And I want to detail into this larger yellow flower. And I'm going to radiate the detail lines from the center, fan them out. I want to define the petals separately. I want this to feel like they're separate petals. So this is essentially becoming a side view flower. And I'm using a darker color because I really want it to show up. But if you're more subtle in terms of your aesthetic, use just a darker yellow, not necessarily an orange like I'm using. You can also start that line work from the outer edge of the petal inwards. It just doesn't create as effortless a look. You have to be a little bit more careful with how you place the line work brush strokes when you're going from the outer edge of the petal inward. A little bit of cat's tongue action because I'm going to blend some of those areas that I felt were a little bit awkward. That's the thing. If you have some line work or some areas of your painting and you kind of are second guessing your initial decision, your initial placement of brush strokes, just go in that area with a little clean water and blend it out, and it just becomes a shadow. Done. Beautiful. Remember what I said earlier, a lot of white space is not a bad thing. You don't have to feel like you have to fill the whole page. All right, I've got a dark green on my liner brush, and I'm finally going into that original leaf. She's my focal point, and I'm adding some line work. I am letting the paint run out. I'm pressing down right about at the middle of the stroke to get some thickness, and I am still consciously following the contour of that leaf. A little bit of green, a little bit of brown. I've got a lot of pre-mixed greens on this palette, and look at that curve. Don't feel like all of your line work brush strokes need to be the same shape, direction, or thickness. Mix it up a little bit. This is nature that we're trying to capture here, friends, and nature is the queen of variety. All right, now that splotch on this leaf is pretty well managed. I mean, I can still see it. I'm sure now you see it now that I'm calling it out. But once we get in there and add a little love and excitement, she's going to disappear. All right, I've got a little bit of a brown, do like a raw umber, an ochre, or something like that. A little bit of green. See how I mix it up? I'm always grabbing something different. And I strategically placed this line work just over that weird splotchy area to even further camouflage it. Beautiful. That worked out really well. I'm pleased. A little bit of extra leafy bottom of this bouquet work down here. This was more of just a glide and lift with my 1/2 inch dagger. Can you believe it, friends? We're here. We used flooding, ombre, lifting, scrubbing, and line work. And now we can see how they all work together. Oh my gosh. What a blast. So I want you to hit me up in comments right now if you're energized, if you're the least bit mind blown, if you're like, what just happened? Any of the emotions, I want you to hit me up in comments and say, what? Question mark. And of course, ask me any questions that you have because I'm sure you're going to have a lot. I hope you have a lot. Let's keep this conversation going. This has been incredible. Thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for sticking through to the end. And friends, I have just one thing to say. Happy painting. And friends, if you're curious, if you want a condensed down version of this, and I mean majorly condensed down, I have this video where I teach you the basics of watercolor in 5 minutes flat. So go ahead and watch this next, and we'll see you soon.